Take a moment to think about the following questions. Do you feel compelled to work? Is your work difficult to stop thinking about? Are you upset if you have to miss a day of work? Do you tend to work beyond the actual requirements of your job? If so, you might be a workaholic, and so are almost half of U.S. workers. Our guest today is Malissa Clark, author of Never Not Working: Why the Always-On Culture is Bad for Business and How to Fix It. Malissa is an associate professor of industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Georgia, where she has been on the faculty since 2013. And she joined us for a deep conversation all about workaholism, what it is, why it matters, and what we can do about it. If you care at all about your work and your life, this is simply an episode you can't miss. Stay tuned for our conversation with Malissa Clark. Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
Malissa Clark, welcome to the Indigo Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We are super excited to talk with you today, and we're going to be talking about workaholism, and we're most specifically going to be talking about your book, Never Not Working. So we're so excited to delve into those conversations. We've been, up all night just obsessing about reading the book and making sure that we were over-prepared for this interview.
Sounds like this is the perfect book for you, then.
I even leaned in to extra reading for this episode.
Oh, wow. I love it.
So we're going to kind of walk through a handful of different topics related to the book. And I think maybe where we can start is just the workaholism landscape, so to speak. And let's do a little problem identification. What's going on out there in the world of work that you really cared enough about to research both in a scholarly context and in this popular press book?
Yeah, well, it sounds like you might relate to, something that I've struggled with my whole life, really, feeling like I needed to always be on, always be doing something, going, from a young age, really. And didn't really realize there was a term to describe this feeling that I, always kind of had towards overachieving and going above and beyond. And I found out there's a term called workaholism that kind of put all the pieces together. And it was my aha moment. And I realized, wow, I think I'm a workaholic. And so I set out to understand it from a scientific perspective.
So as they say, sometimes our research is really me-search, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's actually what I call it. I call it me-search, trying to understand myself better.
Nothing wrong with that, for sure.
And isn't that the perennial joke about, now you guys are IO psych people, industrial and organizational psychologists, but maybe it's the same thing. People go into psychology to help others or to help themselves. And I think that's great. It's only natural,
right? We're curious. We want to understand, the way we are and the dynamics around us. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think that's it's always in the zeitgeist is like, the man really stinks. That I'm a worker. You don't understand me. I'm the victim here. But I really loved how you kicked off this book, because you kicked off with some inconvenient truths, as it were, that the average worker is working fewer hours than ever before. And you know what? Back in the day, there wasn't children were your retirement plan.
Right?
Yeah. So what's the problem here? In the work,
like
how can you have workaholism?
Feel like they work longer, right? So it was all these contradictions that I just, like you said, I threw that at the beginning to really confuse people. But it's actually true. When you look at the data, we are working less than ever before. However, because we're so tethered to work now, particularly with our smartphones and technology, it really, it's difficult to quantify hours worked because we're actually always on. If you think about it, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm always checking my email. I'm always, pulling out my laptop when I'm watching TV. So when you think about the actual time we're working, it's hard to quantify. Yes, hours worked are less, but work is almost like more all-consuming, if that makes sense.
Yeah, would you say that this is a kind of an across-the-board problem, or is this a knowledge worker problem? Is it something, I mean, are plumbers and tradespeople, are they dealing with similar types of issues? Do we have data on that?
Those are great questions. And, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of data on a wide variety of occupations. It does seem to be extremely prevalent, particularly with knowledge workers, because one of the components of workaholism is not being able to shut work off in your brain. And so, knowledge workers in particular, always working on some creative project or that kind of thing. But I will say, it's complicated. Individuals that are in kind of lower wage occupations, maybe they're not a workaholic in the classic sense, but there's a whole different host of problems that I know we don't really have time to get into today, that maybe they're being paid so little that they actually have to work 2-3 jobs. So they're workaholics in the sense that they are literally working all the time and having very little time for anything else. And that's a function of underpayment, right? They're just not, they're not making a living wage. And so that is a huge problem, and we need a ton more research on that. Most of the workaholism research is unfortunately pretty exclusively to knowledge workers and occupations that you might think of, lawyers and doctors and but I will say, it's funny because some of the research that I've done where I've interviewed individuals and spouses, you wouldn't believe the range of occupations where I find workaholics. So in that sense, they do seem to be everywhere.
Gotcha. But, workaholism, as you talk about in the book, is not just hours worked. Right. So I think it's probably important for us relatively early on in this conversation to give our listeners a more clear definition of what workaholism is and maybe what it isn't.
Absolutely. So the way scholars define workaholism is working excessively and working compulsively. So the behavioral part, that's the long hours. That's the more obvious component, working longer than is necessary, taking work home, taking work on vacations. But the compulsive aspect is also multifaceted. There's a motivational component where we actually call this driven to work by introjected motivation. So feeling like you ought to be working all the time, that you should be working, which is different than intrinsic motivation, which is underlying work engagement. Another component of workaholism is the cognitive component, not being able to shut work off in your mind, thinking about work all the time. Maybe it's keeping you up at night, that kind of thing. And finally, there's an emotional component that when you're not working, you feel guilty, you feel anxious, or maybe even frustrated that someone or something is preventing you from being able to finish this work thing, even though it's 9 o'clock at night, something like that. So yeah, it's multifaceted, but it's definitely more than just hours worked. Absolutely.
What about working to avoid problems at home? It's like you could go home and deal with your kids that don't have a fully developed neocortex yet, or you could put in 2 extra hours on that project. Would that be workaholism?
Well, as a mom of 2, I can tell you that working a paid job is easier in many ways than taking care of kids at home. So, yeah, I mean, but I get it but it's not, inherent in the definition of workaholism. But people can be driven to work from a variety of different reasons. I'm not saying that's not impossible.
Yeah. Which brings me to another question that I had a little bit further down in our agenda here, but I think I'd just like to ask it now is, why do we work? I mean, aside from the obvious of I need to make some money, I have to pay bills, what function do you think work has in our lives?
So we're taking money completely out of the equation. I was just talking with my class about, well, I teach motivation, and, we talked about a study where individuals were told, well, if you won the lottery and you didn't really need the financial aspect, would you stop working? And, half the people said yes, and half the people said no. And so, I think for a lot of us, work is one of those things that is a part of our identity. And for many people, it's perhaps the biggest part of their identity. And I think as humans, like having a purpose, many of us through our jobs want to be able to make an impact to society, to make the world a better place. And so, there are a lot of reasons besides money that I think drive people to work. And that's where it gets tricky, because you can be driven to work because of this passion, and that's all admirable and great. However, is there a point where the passion becomes an obsession? And that's where, it's almost like the too much of a good thing effect.
Right. Well, I suspect we'll come back to some of these different themes, because there's a lot that I would love to unpack there. But, you touch on something that brought another question to mind, where you talk about some different myths, and you suggest that, one of the myths about workaholism is that there are good workaholics. And you say, no, there are no good workaholics. Say more about that.
Yeah, that's definitely a pervasive myth. But I'll go to bat with anyone to contradict this. The kernel of truth, I will say, is there's some evidence that, for example, let me back up a little bit. So one good type of workaholic that I hear about is the engaged workaholic. And so these are individuals that they exhibit the characteristics of workaholism that I've talked about, but they're also an engaged worker. And so the components of work engagement, you feel vigorous and energized when you're working. You're driven by intrinsic motivation. And, the research definitely shows that work engagement is linked to a whole host of positive outcomes. And so that's where this myth kind of comes up. Well, and there is some research to show that the engaged workaholics, the engaged part of it can buffer some of the negative outcomes of workaholism, like negative health outcomes, for example. That's the kernel of truth. All right. So I'll give you that much. But on the other hand, there's other research showing that any good effects of work engagement are essentially washed out by workaholism over time, eventually. There might be some positive outcomes in the short run, but, for a whole host of reasons, if you're constantly, compulsively, and excessively working, you can't do that forever, and it will catch up with you. And so it can only be positive for so long, I would argue.
And I want to hold up that these types of people are pillars in our society.
Yes, absolutely.
They go to the top universities. Their kids are all above average, right? This is like the Lake Wobegon on steroids, right?
Well, I talked to Adam Grant. He said he is an engaged workaholic too, and he's one of my idols. And I feel like I kind of am too. I love my job, and I am driven by intrinsic motivation, while at the same time I feel this sense of, I ought to be working, I ought to be doing this. So yeah, these are the people that we look up to. And, there's the saying, do what you love and you'll never feel like you're working a day in your life, that kind of thing. But
lies.
Again,
these are lies, listeners. And it's in this book. So don't be thinking that this is some campy cure your workaholism with Windex and these 3 easy tricks. This is well-researched, put together stuff, but we do it live on this, Melissa. So tell us the story about what you were doing with your pregnancy.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
this is crazy.
I was pretty vulnerable in the book because it's an embarrassing story, right? Those of you that have read the book, you two have, and so all right, so I was in graduate school when I had both of my kids. And so I was pregnant with my first child, and also was in the middle of the semester. I was taking a full load of classes, and I was teaching my own class as instructor of record as well. And I remember I was at a coffee shop. I was trying to finish up a midterm, and I all of a sudden started having contractions. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst timing. Could not be worse. I was frustrated. Sound familiar? That I couldn't finish this midterm. And so I stuck it out. I stayed there for at least like 2 hours, and I had a little notepad, and I was timing my contractions, and they were kind of all over the place. So I was like, I got time. It's fine. And finally I decided, when it was getting pretty uncomfortable and the contractions were getting close enough, that I was like, all right, I just need to call it quits. And so I reluctantly packed up my stuff and then went home and gathered my husband, and we went to the hospital. And I had been in labor that whole time. So yes, classic workaholic, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
This is what an engaged workaholic. Okay. And so then, sorry, you don't get off this easy, Melissa. But so then you have your kid, and how quickly are you back teaching and stuff?
Oh, yeah. So we had our spring break was that week that I gave birth. And so I had that week off, and then I took 1 week on top of that. And then I went back.
My goodness.
I know.
Wow.
Everyone that's fighting for maternity leave is throwing tomatoes. But I got to say,
yes,
I was touched by that story and the vulnerability there, because if you took a survey of CEOs, I guarantee, and you described what an engaged workaholic looked like, they'd be like, how many of these can we get? Can we talk to HR? And it's the wrong answer.
Right.
And it's strategically short-sighted, which Melissa does an excellent job of expounding on in this book. So
thank you.
You talk about 4 main components of workaholism, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got, let's go into these briefly. You have behavioral, motivational, cognitive, and emotional. Can you just describe those briefly?
Sure. So the behavioral component, this is the long work hours. This is working longer than is necessary, taking on additional projects, not leaving work at work when you go home. And so, doing things like taking work on vacation. Can I tell you a funny story? So this past New Year's was the first time in my adult working life that I went on vacation and did not take my laptop.
Wow.
So that's the behavioral component.
How did it feel?
Terrifying, but also good. Terrifying, but really refreshing. So that was a little sidebar, but that's the behavioral component. The motivational component, as I mentioned, there are different motivators for why we do things. And so one of the key motivational drivers of workaholism is what we call introjected motivation. So this stems from self-determination theory, where it's like partially internalized beliefs about what we should be doing. Think about how society puts this pressure on us for how we should work. And this manifests as these feelings that we ought to be working, that if we're idle, we're not doing what we should be doing as a good worker, as a good human being. Isn't this what we were born to do? Is work, work, work. And so that's the motivational component, the cognitive component, thinking about work all the time, not being able to shut it off. This is the rumination part, right? So you might be thinking of things that happened that day or things that are going to happen in the future. Regardless, you're thinking about work. So you might be distracted, for example, when you're with your family or your friends because of something work related. It's just, you can't turn it off. And then the fourth component, that's the emotional component, where you feel negative emotions when you are not working or when you're prevented from working. So, when you're not at work, you feel anxious, you feel guilty, almost like this pit in your stomach that manifests as like, oh gosh, to me, it's like almost like anxiety that it can only be curbed if I handle whatever work thing I'm obsessing about at the minute.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's multifaceted. Absolutely.
One thing I wonder, and I was talking with Chris about this when we were preparing for this episode, is, I was just describing going through graduate school and getting your PhD, getting a tenure track job, working towards and earning tenure. It seems like that entire system, at least the way that we kind of do it here, maybe in the United States, is perfectly designed to attract, select, and retain workaholics. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's Schneider's ASA model, attraction, selection, attrition. So individuals that are type A, hard driving perfectionists, they're attracted to these types of occupations and fields that that kind of expect that in their top performers. So you hear a lot of, academics and in law and consulting and doctors and a lot of these occupations, same thing. But in academia, it's almost like you're constantly competing against each other. How many publications did you have compared to the others in your field who are studying the same topic? And, rewarding the number of publications, which it takes a lot of time and effort to get out one. And here we are expecting, 4 or 5 of them in a year, just to keep up with everybody else. And there's always the next promotion to be thinking about as your next goal. So, it doesn't really stop, does it?
Well, it not really. I think that the way it stopped for me is I just stopped caring about a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Right. And it worked for me. I mean, and it's easy to say that because I do have tenure, but I think, I have a number of aspects of the rest of my life that I have a flexible enough sense of self that I don't depend upon my identity being formed completely by that one piece. Right. So I think that kind of helps in a way.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I also just wonder about this, maybe the engaged workaholic. It seems like there's evidence to suggest fairly convincingly that it's not good for the workaholic, him or herself. It's probably not good for their families. It also seems maybe that society, modernity, has evolved in a way that has completely depended upon and benefited from workaholics. I don't know if that's true. Like, would we have iPhones if Steve Jobs wasn't an obsessive jerk who worked really, really long hours? What do you think about that?
I hate the framing of that question, Ben.
Then you answer it, or ask it differently.
I don't know if that's the right way, because the question how I think of is, are moral sacrifices worth it to make progress? And I think that's a dark hallway to look down.
Maybe.
Yeah, and it's also working under the assumption that the only way you can get these groundbreaking ideas is if you're working 80 hours a week. I mean, I don't know about you, but some of my most creative ideas have come when I'm, walking around the block, just, taking a half hour to get a breath of fresh air, and then it comes to me, and they show this in the creativity literature, and, so I'm not convinced. I think that we have all these models that, we could look to them as examples. But that's not the only way you can get these great innovations.
Sure. And I would also point this, I think it speaks to how you articulate it as another myth of workaholism, is that workaholics are more productive, right? So that's not what the evidence suggests. That, and to your point with creativity and with other types of productivity metrics, if we were able to, some things I think is very, very difficult to actually measure productivity, but depending on the nature of the job. But it does seem like that type of excessive compulsive orientation towards work doesn't necessarily benefit either the work or the person themselves in the long run, right?
Right. Yeah. There is some research showing that workaholism predicts decreased work engagement over
Sure.
time. And I was just reading an article this morning about, and it's not related to workaholism, but it was just about communication technology being tethered to our work. And that decreases work engagement too. And so, when we think about these individuals that we put up on pedestals, yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the cumulative effect, especially, one, it's going to wear them down. And two, part of what makes work engagement so great is that you are able to have these wonderful breakthroughs and you're very energized when you're at work. But work engagement really doesn't speak to what you're doing after work. And the rest and recovery literature is pretty clear that if you want engaged workers, you actually need to, it's even more important to have rest and recovery after work for those that are highly engaged in their work so that they can come back the next day and feel rested and ready to hit the ground running.
Sure.
I want to describe what it seems to me like this really crucible that exists. On the one hand, hey, look at Tim. Tim's working hard over there. Go, Tim. Why can't more people be like Tim? But now let's describe Tim using those for Tim's behaviors are weird. He is totally in the work. He can't think broadly about the other stuff. His motivations are, I can't feel okay about myself if I'm not stirring the soup or whatever. Right? This is like insanity. Cognitive. I can't stop thinking. We use the term rumination. Like people that have rumination issues struggle generally with a lot of depression and a bunch of stuff. And their emotions aren't like, this is the description of somebody that's not doing well. Right? And I know you can't use the term crazy. I don't know the right terms, how to describe.
Then I think a lot of us would be crazy if we used to describe workaholics. Yeah, absolutely.
But
though.
Any other thing that you felt that way about, everybody'd be like, man, you've got to get help. This is not okay. But when it comes to work, we're like, nice job, Tim.
Exactly. We're rewarding it. It's the only acceptable addiction, not only just acceptable, it's worshipped. And that's what's so wild about this.
Another thing that I think is really interesting is, there's this, it does seem like culturally we worship it to some extent. And the other thing I was wondering and just thinking about is many jobs, right, need certain personality characteristics. Most notably, of course, is conscientiousness. And if we look at the measure for conscientiousness, what kind of correlation would we have there with workaholism, right? I mean, if you look at the short measure of conscientiousness, it's things like, I'm always prepared. I pay attention to details. I get my things done right away. I carry out my plans. I make plans and I stick to them. I don't waste my time. I find it easy to get down to work. I don't do just enough to get by. I see things through. I don't shirk my duties. Like all of that is conscientiousness.
Right.
And so another thing I was just wondering, maybe in some of your scholarly research or things you've read of others, have you come across anybody that's looked at just some of those personality characteristics and how they correlate with workaholism?
Well, workaholism is definitely strongly correlated with type A personality and perfectionism, particularly the negative aspects of perfectionism, feeling like you can't live up to your own standards. I conducted a meta-analysis, and I know we looked at the big five, and off the top of my head, not sure of the correlation with conscientiousness. I can pull it up here, but I think they were positively correlated, but not as strong as you might think. Not as strong as type A personality and perfectionism.
Gotcha. Which that makes me feel a little bit better, right? Because I was thinking, oh my gosh, like as I was a psychologist, we've just been telling people for decades to select for these types of folks, right? But perhaps it's not as dire as that.
Right. Well, I mean, conscientiousness, again, has been shown to link to job performance and, like you said, built into a lot of selection systems. And so I'm not saying conscientiousness is bad, but I'm a big fan of the idea of too much of a good thing, and that exists with conscientiousness as well. Extreme conscientiousness can be problematic, and one of the problematic things might be an inability to detach from work.
All right. So real quick, we talked about the engaged workaholic. Let's list the other types, because there are other types. And if a listener may be one of those and might need to go pick up this book right now, the book is Never Not Working by Malissa Clark, to get some self-help here. So what are the other types of workaholics?
Well, let's see. So yeah, the engaged workaholic is really the one that most people talk about. I'm honestly not a huge fan of typologies, just because it simplifies things to, I think, make it easier to digest as a general population. But I don't know. I think you lose a lot of the nuance. And so early workaholism research, they were really set on identifying types of workaholics, and they came up with all these crazy names for them, like the bulimic workaholic or the anxious workaholic and the engaged workaholic. And so, yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not sure there's a lot of value in talking about like types of workaholics, quote unquote. It's probably more useful, in my opinion, to just focus on thinking about workaholism and these dimensions of workaholism as a continuum, that you might have workaholic tendencies for a couple of these dimensions, but maybe not all of them. And also to varying degrees. And the same thing goes for work engagement. It's almost like two levers that you can be high on both, or medium on both, low on both, or any variant, of that. And I think it's just important to think about, well, even if I have some of these tendencies to, ruminate or take work home with me, maybe it's still worth paying attention to what the research is showing, because it might not be to that extreme that you're not full blown, quote unquote, workaholic, but you may have some negative habits or tendencies that you can work on improving. And maybe you didn't even realize that you were doing some of these things. Like I didn't realize I was doing some of these that I learned about in my interviews for the book. One woman I spoke to, she talked about working light. I was like, what is this concept? And then I realized I do it all the time. And I would classify that as the behavioral component of workaholism. And so really this is basically integrating something fun to make you feel like you're not working, but also you're working at the same time. So one woman I spoke to, she would have a glass of wine while she was working. And to her, it was like, it wasn't work because she was also enjoying this glass of wine. For me, it's, I'm watching this TV show. We're catching up. We just watched, the last episode of True Detective last night. And so, working light would be pulling out my laptop and handling a couple emails at the same time I'm watching this really riveting show. And I think I actually did that for about 5 minutes. And I was like, wait, what am I doing? No, putting this away. So I think just paying attention to some of those things is important.
No, I think that's good. Everybody who's a workaholic isn't an Ivy League multi-marathoner per year.
Yeah.
You can be a regular person and still be dipping in, right? Like, some people have problematic drinking, but they're not hammered all the time or driving drunk, right? Like you said, there's a spectrum that you can deal with. And you talk about the two levers early in the book. What are those two levers?
Yeah. So for this, I think of, workaholism and work engagement. They are positively correlated with each other. And so each one of those is its own construct that you can have, you can relate to it to varying degrees. And so I think about the workaholism lever How many of these workaholic tendencies do you have and to what degree? And then the other lever, if you think about work engagement, those aspects of feeling vigor and dedicated and absorbed in your work. And so there's a lever with work engagement too, and they can work in tandem. And the type of, the engaged workaholic, you would be high on both of those levers, for example. So you would be engaged, but you would also have a lot of these workaholic tendencies as well.
It's so interesting. I'd like to kind of go back to something we touched on earlier, and that's this idea of purpose and meaning. And we know from our science that purpose and meaning is important for job satisfaction. It's important for motivation. It's big part of what we call the job characteristics model when we're looking at the work itself, the significance of a job or its task. And I guess I just wonder, so we say this is really important for work. If you want motivated, satisfied people, they should be deriving a lot of purpose and meaning from their work. But, it seems like some organizations maybe ran with that advice that we, based upon the science, have told them is really good. And they've made work very meaningful, or at least seem like it, tried to really imbue job tasks and responsibilities with a lot of purpose. And I just wonder, do we bear any blame in social science for some of this? It seems one could make the argument perhaps that, hey, Google ran with our advice. They made it great to be at work 24/7.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like maybe society maybe is more to blame than us.
Melissa's like, they're not listening to us anyway.
Whose fault is this? 1, 2, 3, not it.
Right? Yeah. No, let's not blame us, please.
Well, I think it's hard to pin that to one thing.
Because I do think that they're, making our jobs, you talked about job characteristics model. Yeah, we can get a lot more meaning out of our work when we can see a task from beginning to end, and we see the significance of our work and how it impacts other people. And all of that, I would argue, is great. Now, where the Googles of the world, I think, went wrong is that they made work so great that there was no reason to leave work. Everything and anything was there. I think it's possible to create a very enriching work environment, but also to promote rest and recovery. And that rest and recovery needs to also happen outside of work, and at work, I would say too. But also it's important to leave work and have multiple things that are meaningful to you in life, whether it's your family, your kids, your hobby, your community, your church, whatever it is. It makes you a more well-rounded person. You bring all of those different experiences to work, and that can help with a lot of idea generation and just different perspectives that you're bringing back to work. But also it's very good for your health too, to be able to get out of that stressful environment. And the rest and recovery literature, I just love the work. And it's, in my opinion, super important to really consciously think about how you can build that into your organizational environment too.
All right. So Google, I'm going to throw in an idea, a kind of a big data idea-ish. Well, okay, you're awesome. You just graduated from MIT and you're like, hey, listen, the workaholism is bad, but I'm just going to bite off 6 years of this so I can get ahead in my field and get launched. Would you tell that guy he's got some stinking thinking, or is there some benefits to some early career workaholism?
Oh, these are tough questions. I do think that in our careers, there's going to be ebbs and flows, right? There's going to be periods that we are going to probably want to work longer and other times where we want to take a step back. And it's just going to vary depending on our life circumstance. And when you're fresh out of college and you don't have kids yet, and maybe you don't even have a partner yet, sure, that might be a good time to spend the extra hours. But there's also a trap, right? So if you get into this mindset of this is what it takes to succeed, and maybe you're in an environment where that's expected, it's not really expected for just a temporary basis. It's expected for your whole career for you to continue at that pace. And so it can be difficult to make changes if that's the mentality when you start your career. I don't know, but I'm torn though, because I'm also, I can relate to that person because that was me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I had
do as I say, not as I do.
I know. I had a really intense sales job right out of college, and I was working all the time. And
and your academic career benefited probably from some of those tendencies early on, right?
Early on, probably did. Yeah, I know that. So it's like, I'm not opposed to hard work. I'm definitely not. And I think it's just important to recognize that, you know, in your career, yes, you might have periods where you're working, you know, more than other times in your career, but it can't be that can't be your entire career. It just, you will eventually, your body will tell you otherwise. Every single person I interviewed for the book that identifies as a workaholic, at some point, every single person I talked to had some sort of health complication that, regardless of if they wanted to make any changes to their lifestyle, they had to. A couple people, you know, they had such debilitating medical issues that they physically could not work. And it was devastating to them. I mean, really heart-wrenching stories where it was almost like, you know, an identity crisis. Like, what am I doing here? What is my purpose in life if I can't work, you know? And that's another thing to consider. If work is your everything, when you start your career and then it continues to be your everything, there's a lot riding on that one thing, you know. So I think having multiple identities, things that are really important and, you know, meaningful to us, it is beneficial for our well-being, broadly speaking.
All right. So that was a setup. Great answer. Okay. I love that answer. Here's the big data setup. If you're a big organization, can you go measure how to dial this in to the minimum amount of human flourishing or the maximum amount of acceptable workaholism displayed by your workforce with keeping average longevity high, engagement? You see what I'm saying? You could almost get to this place. It's like, listen, we're going to assess. We need somebody a 7 out of 10 on a workaholism scale.
Right.
Because they're going to give us the most bang for our employment buck. What do you say to that or think about that?
I mean, what do you think we should do?
I think there's a lot of jackwagons with no moral fiber, and I could give a rip what they think. They should go jump in the lake, you know? But there is that idea, and I got this from when I worked at a call center for Dell Computers. Those guys had every minute and it was exhausting. And hey, it didn't matter. And you're selling to people that that can't order a computer for themselves off the internet. So they're not savvy tech purchasers. And you would have to walk them through the whole sales process. And I forget. And your bathroom breaks were timed. You only got so many. And at that point, I hated big data for driving productivity from that moment on.
It turns into time and motion studies, like the original, you know, engineering mentality, and, you know, just treating humans as just people to carry out the work, but not actually human.
Yeah.
And having, you know, personalities and needs and interests and values. So you're over quantifying it, I guess I might say.
And I want to say another piece on that is I get it. If you're a CEO of somebody who's competing globally against people who have chew up their people worse than we chew them up here in the United States. We're talking child labor, human trafficking, all that stuff. Changing, my view, sorry, brief soapbox. If you change your morality of how you view people and work here and insist on that from your vendors and suppliers, you're not just making your community better or your workforce better, you're making the world better through your work practices. As somebody who has kids, I don't want child labor touching anything that I consume. And I think, yes, maybe it may degrade our wealth of shiny, worthless plastic things, but it'll increase our existential wealth. This is where you should be investing anyway. Sorry, ran over.
No, I love that. I definitely agree. That was great. Very well put.
That's a good rant. And kind of on that note, when we were prepping for this episode and talking about it, Chris and I talked a little bit about how it really seems like part of the equation, and I'm not sure exactly where it fits in, but it seems like part of the problem and part of the solution perhaps is that people do perhaps need to be thinking more about going on a bit of that existential self-exploration and figuring out what really is important for them, for their lives, how they are going to find personal meaning in this crazy world, and perhaps considering that work shouldn't be the center of that universe.
Yeah. There's a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. I don't know if that's the exact title, but yeah, I mean, so the number 2 regret was, I wish I hadn't worked so much, of people that were on their deathbed. And the number 1 was, I wish I had lived the life that I wanted to live, not what I was expected or what other people thought I should live.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think COVID did, it was really eye-opening for so many people. And, we had the Great Resignation that came after that. And I think in part because people realized just how precious life is and, what is really important when we really think about our lives and what we're doing here and our purpose. And people realized just how important family was and friends. And, I think it's quickly forgotten sometimes when we kind of just go back to the regular work coming out of the pandemic, and now we're seeing pullbacks of remote work. And, I feel like it's like, don't you remember that, all of the companies started talking about employee mental health and, how remote work was actually better than they thought it could ever be. And, oh, by the way, everyone, the data actually shows you can be just as productive, if not more, but we need people to be at work and show face time and, kind of forgetting really, there's a different way of working. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think it's important to think about the big picture and, and I know it can seem really difficult because it's like, how can we change? This is how we've always been. And this is our model of work. That's the problem though. This is our societal expectation of the ideal worker.
Say that again. Why should we change? Now, imagine anybody saying that about their business model or their competitive strategy. Well, why should we change? Let's just buggy whip it straight to no. So if you can evolve your business model, if you can evolve your products to meet a competitive landscape, you can evolve your way of doing life to better meet the psychological, emotional, and just gosh darn values-driven ways that you treat your workforce and society.
Yes, I totally agree.
I just also was thinking about how it's unfortunate that with things like workaholism, it seems like sometimes it takes major life events to kind of force us to think differently and to change. You dedicate this book to Alex and Evan, which I assume are the names of your children, right?
Yes.
Why?
They're the most important people in my life. I would do anything for them, anything at all.
how did having your children change your orientation towards work? I mean, we talked about obviously when you were giving birth to your first and that experience, but how has it changed just how you see work and life together?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, having kids of my own and having a partner and realizing just how much joy can come from that part of my life, it really helps solidify all of the things I had been reading about, related to work-life balance and having, meaningful things outside of work and how that can actually make you a better worker. And so to me, it just reinforced things that I had read about in the literature. And to me, I constantly struggle with, my workaholic tendencies, but reminding myself of, well, what do I really value? And, thinking about long-term, what do I want in the long term? Is it more important for me to be the top person in my field and in this area and to have all these accolades? Or is it more important to have good relationships with my kids and with my spouse? Well, to me, it's the latter. And so I constantly have to remind myself, well, I can't be sacrificing this time with my kids and with my family. Sure, succeeding at work is another goal of mine. It is a big part of my identity, but when I think about what really matters to me, I don't want to be sitting on my deathbed saying, I wish I hadn't worked so much.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that that's absolutely the right way to be thinking about this whole landscape of how we navigate our work and our careers. And certainly, I think so the three of us, we all have children here in this conversation. I think they really do matter when it comes to how we think about life in general. Having children certainly changes your perspectives, and not to throw a big grenade into the conversation, but about 3.5 years ago, I lost a child, right? So thank you. So that experience, right, is one in which it certainly caused a reevaluation of priorities, of how I approach work. I mean, Chris was with me through that whole thing. I mean,
I front row seat. You'd never wish this on anyone, but Ben took something that was really the worst and has made himself better for it. I benefit from the new Ben as his business partner. Honestly, I'm getting all choked up over here, but it's true. It's true.
Well, and I think that, Chris, you'd probably agree that I have perhaps some workaholic tendencies, right?
Oh my God. Yes.
But I think it's this idea. We had a guest in a previous episode talking a lot about character and so forth. And it was Eric Helzer. Remember that episode, Chris? And he mentioned, this idea of we need to be thinking not just about our resume values, but our eulogy values.
How will we be remembered?
And that's super important. So let's just shift gears a little bit into thinking a little bit about how an organization might give an indication that they're creating kind of a perfect climate for workaholism. What kinds of things might they be doing? And, one way to maybe think about this is, hey, I'm interviewing for a job. I'm looking at different organizations. I'm trying to evaluate some culture. What might be some indications that there's a lot of workaholics there and maybe I should run away or take a different offer?
Yeah, great question. I think that you can learn a lot by looking for what we call organizational artifacts. So there's many ways that organizations can signal what they value, and it oftentimes might not match exactly what they're telling you, in terms of their benefit package or all of their perks that they offer. But, when you dig a little deeper, you can maybe start to get some clues. Hopefully you can get the clues before you accept a job that you're going to end up hating. But, some of the clues you don't really know until you're in it. But for example, you can look at how are new employees socialized. You know, when you start the job, you know, probably people are going to be telling you, look, this is really what the boss is going to care about. And, you know, yeah, we have these, you know, we have unlimited vacation days, but, you know, really most people take like 5, you know, that kind of thing. Who's rewarded is a big one too. Look at, you know, who's getting the promotions, who's getting the bonuses at the end of the year. Are these the people that are pulling the all-nighters and working 80 hours a week? And are those the reasons people are saying that they got the bonus? That's a pretty clear signal. What's valued is to look at who's rewarded.
Sure.
You can ask if you're still interviewing for the job, you can ask people who work there, you know, tell me about what it's like to work with our boss. You know, what's his, what are his communication patterns, for example? And maybe you can get some hints there. You know, I think a common perpetuator of this always on culture is the communication that we have with our people on our team, our coworkers. And, you know,
totally.
How often does the supervisor text or email after hours or on the weekends? You know, does the team tend to kind of get wrapped up in these text conversations at 9:00 at night pretty regularly? That's a pretty big signal that there's probably an always on culture, right? It's just kind of the norm. It's just what's expected.
This is such the norm, so much so that any consulting engagement, I make sure that all the key stakeholders have my cell.
Yeah.
Because if things are going sideways, you know they're talking smack about you behind your back, right? These jack wagons, and it's a molehill has blown up into a mountain, but that's a symptom of this always on culture. So if you find yourself, right, you're a hard charger who wants to do well, but you're also evidence-based. You've read Melissa Clark's Never Not Working book, which is available everywhere good books are sold, Amazon, all that stuff. Go get it, because it's not just about individuals. It's about leaders and organizations and what you can do about it. But if you're an individual that is stuck in one of these places where workaholism is a norm, is there anything you can do to survive until maybe your next gig, or maybe change the culture around you as an individual?
I think so. I think, well, it would be great if you had a great supervisor, because the supervisor plays the most direct role with your day-to-day, you know, work activities, right? So can we assume that you have a supervisor that's somewhat receptive to conversations? You could talk about setting boundaries, you know, mention to your supervisor that, you know, I'm not going to be available between these hours, but I'll make sure, you know, that I'm always available, you know, starting every day at 8:30 or whatever. And so just communicate those boundaries. You know, if you have a supervisor, though, that doesn't respect those boundaries, I think you're going to have to, well, while you are looking for another job, you can start by forcing yourself to prioritize you and your well-being within the parameters of this environment that probably isn't the healthiest. And so put things on your to-do list that are specifically for yourself. You know, walk for 30 minutes, meditate for 5 minutes, 2 times a day or something, and actually put it on your to-do list and make it a priority for you. To build in that rest and recovery as much as you can. You know, but ideally, though, hopefully you can have a work team with some good colleagues and a supervisor that does understand the value of having a life outside of work and the value of rest and recovery. And so you see this too in consulting organizations or really hard driving cultures. You see pockets of teams that actually they have more balance than you might think, even within this hard driving culture. And so you can create your own little bubble if you have the right people around you. So maybe you could do a lateral transfer too to some other team that maybe the supervisor is more receptive and is more supportive of employee balance.
Yeah. Well, and supervisors are just so important, right? And and we're going to try to start bringing this in for a landing here shortly. This has just been, time flies when you're having fun, Melissa. If you are a supervisor, what might leaders, managers, supervisors do perhaps to try to get ahead of creating or perpetuating a culture of workaholism and also maybe addressing some of those tendencies in themselves?
Yeah, I think being a good role model too is a great place to start, right? So your employees are looking to you for your signals that you're sending. So it's not what you tell them is important. It's what you're actually showing them is important. So as a leader, if you have to leave in the middle of the day to take care of a family thing, or you want to leave early to catch your son's soccer game, make it be known that you're doing that, right? And so set that example. That's the first thing. The other thing is you can implement some speed bumps too for yourself and for your team. And so, for example, one speed bump, you can leverage technology to help you break your cycle of communication with your team. And so once you set these boundaries of, all right, so we're really going to try to curb the after hours communication. So an extra speed bump might be to set your email platform, or, make it so you have an alert that pops up if you try to send an email after hours. And some companies have this already implemented, which is great. I wish more did, where it pops up and it says, are you sure you want to send this email? Or do you want to schedule it for the next day when when the workday starts? I love that idea. So it's kind of just building in a speed bump, right? For yourself, for others. So stuff like that can really make a big difference.
All right. So if you're a CEO, and Ben has this phrase, I love it. The higher up in the organization you go, the funnier your jokes become, because nobody will tell you that maybe the emperor has no clothes or whatever, right? So you've read this book, you're like, hey, I'm concerned about this. If you're at the top or have an organization-wide remit, what should you be looking for, and what are some of the things? You mentioned the speed bumps, but should you be looking for to be like, hey, we should really look at this for our workforce?
Yeah, I'd say you're in a great position to make some real change. I think broadly speaking, conduct some employee surveys, some pulse surveys to see what are their concerns, what do they like about where they're working, what do they not like. Ask some targeted questions about how they feel their workload, their work-life balance, their communication with their supervisor, all of these, try to get a sense of what's actually going on the ground level. And if you get a sense that, wow, it does seem that there's a lot of pressure, employees are feeling a lot of pressure to be always on. And, oh, by the way, they're not utilizing all their vacation days. And, I think gathering data is important, at the CEO level, and kind of looking, asking employees and conduct focus groups would be a good way to get some insight. But you're in a position where you can make a lot of really impactful changes. And so that's an even better position to be in. So read the book. Maybe you'll have some strategies that you pick up from there, but hire some IO psychologists and we can help with that.
There you go. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have a link to your website, which is melissaclark.com, and that's MALISSA Clark.com, and to your book in the show notes. Anywhere else that you want people to go to find out more about you and what you're up to?
My website's a great place. You can connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'd love to connect with folks.
Excellent. So this has just been a wonderful conversation, Melissa. Hope you agree. what else might you like to share with our listeners? We'll let you have the last word here.
Well, I really appreciate you having me. This has been really fun, and I've learned a lot from you two as well. So, I think in writing this book, sometimes it seemed almost like overwhelming that this is so pervasive in our society. How can we possibly make actionable changes? But also moments of hope. And I really was inspired by a lot of the people I talked to. And so, look at what the data is showing about why we should not continue down this road. Look at the 4-day week data, for example, the trials. It's really impressive. And so we can work differently. We don't need to be doing what we have been doing. I would really love to see some monumental changes to how we work and the way we think about work. That's my hope, at least.
Our guest today has been Malissa Clark. Melissa, thanks so much for joining us on the Indigo Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.